Welcome everyone to one of the final sessions of ENIC 2020, but one of the most important topics that I think we could be talking about to conclude the conference. This is our panel on taking customers in vulnerable situations on the net zero journey. I hope you've enjoyed the presentations on some of the innovation projects which are addressing this topic, as well as the rest of the content through the conference and exhibition over the last 2 days. And anything you've missed, there'll be lots of content available via the site and via ENA after the event, so plenty of opportunity to catch up. I'm Matt Hindle, I'm Head of Gas at Energy Networks Association, and I'm joined by a fantastic panel this afternoon who I'll introduce in a second. Clearly, the imperative around decarbonisation and the journey to net zero has probably never been stronger. The 10-point plan published just a few weeks ago has emphasised that the very highest levels of government are treating this as a major priority, and with the UK hosting COP26 next year, that attention is only likely to grow. We're going to see a range of developments over the coming year. The Energy White Paper expected soon should give more detail on that journey. And just today, the Committee on Climate Change Sixth Carbon Budget advice has emphasised the affordability of the transition to net zero on a national basis. But as I think we'll bring out in this discussion, there's still lots to understand about where costs will fall and how we manage the journey to net zero in an equitable way and in a way that brings all customers with us. Innovation can help find new ways to support customers in vulnerable situations, as you've seen in the projects which have been presented at ENIC, and has also been reflected in Ofgem's decisions around the RIIO-2 price control for the gas networks, and that, I think, is a theme that we'll pick up on the panel as we discuss how we support customers over the next 5 years and through that RIIO-2 period. And we know that change is going to bring challenges. New technologies can help, as the projects have shown, but can also create barriers around issues like affordability and accessibility, and I'm sure we'll pick up some of those themes as well. This session focuses very much on the role of the gas networks in addressing issues for customers in vulnerable situations. And I'm joined by Peter Smith, Director of Policy and Research at National Energy Action.
Hello, great. Sorry. Great to be with you.
Thanks, Peter. And Peter is a member of NEA's senior management team working to ensure that the needs of fuel poor and vulnerable households are reflected in policy and regulatory decisions. And as you can see, is hugely enthusiastic about these topics. Nigel Winnan is the Customer and Service Design Manager for Wales and West Utilities, serving customers across Wales and the southwest of England. Hi, Nigel.
Afternoon.
Jo Giles is Customer Safeguarding Manager for Cadent. She founded and now chairs the Energy Industry-wide Safeguarding Customers Working Group alongside the National Mental Capacity Forum Utilities Working Group.
Afternoon, everybody.
Malcolm Arthur, who's currently the Future of Heat Programme Manager for National Grid, covering both electricity and gas.
Hi, Matt. Hi, everybody.
And Kerry Potter, the Group Social Impact and Vulnerability Manager for SGN, leading on social and vulnerability programme design and delivery in Scotland and England's south and southwest regions.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And this is very much designed to be an interactive session, so please do use the Q&A facility. You can see that hopefully on the right of the screen. You can ask a question to the panel in there. It will pop up for everyone to see. And you can also interact with each other using the chat function. Again, that should be on the bottom right of the screen. You just click on that to open it. But let me start by asking our panelists the kind of core question that we have for this session. How do we take people with us on the net zero journey? How do we deliver decarbonisation in a way that makes sure we're not leaving people behind? And if I can ask you, while you're answering that question, I think it's just worth setting out what we mean by customers in vulnerable situations. What does that sort of definition mean in practice. So, Malcolm, would you like to kick us off?
I have myself on mute there, and I did this to the problem of unmuting myself. So, thank you very much, Matt. Yeah. So, I mean, vulnerable customers obviously covers a large number. Obviously we've got fuel poor, we've got old. The definition I was looking at when I was looking at this is one that Ofgem uses, and they have a range of these. And when we look at net zero, and we look at vulnerable consumers today, and we look at the future, the volume of vulnerable customers is potentially going to grow as population gets older. So we need to understand how these are impacted as we take them on. I think one of the things I'm looking at the question specifically, how do we take people with us? I mean, all customers, all consumers need to understand how they are going to meet net zero. And this isn't vulnerable consumers, this is all consumers. And we need to ensure vulnerable consumers have the advice and have the information they know and how they are going to achieve net zero. And we need to make sure that we provide them the right advice, and then how do they get from where they are today to where they need to go future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about heat, because that's my specific understanding. And we all need to adapt our heating systems at home in order to meet net zero. We all need to change something. Now, I say all, the majority of us, the huge majority of us. And if you look at vulnerable consumers, you look at fuel poor, they live in some of the least energy efficient homes. And therefore, if you have a look at the opportunity that net zero gives us, we can provide changes that bring vulnerable consumers, and all consumers, but vulnerable consumers, to improve the current quality of life. So we can improve the energy efficiency of homes, we can provide them new heating solutions, providing them warm and comfortable homes, hopefully improving what they have today. The issue to some extent, which I don't have the answer for, is how do we make sure we can overcome the barrier of affordability and providing them with the right advice and the right information they have in order to take them with us. So I think the how do we make sure that we overcome the cost barriers of this is probably one of the biggest issues, and then how do we make sure they got trusted and impartial advice? Hopefully that answers the question on my side.
Great start, thanks, Malcolm. And Joe, if I can turn to you next, just to reflect on what Malcolm said and kind of how you're thinking about those issues in Cadence World.
Of course. So many of us on the call, we've been working together as an industry for quite a long time now to ensure there's more of a consistent approach. Because obviously this is about ensuring that everybody can be safe, warm and independent in their home. And, it is about, ensuring that we're looking at those life situations and allowing customers, based on their ability to engage as well along this journey, the right consideration, whether that happens to be accessibility, whether that happens to be, as was quite rightly said, working with the relevant partners. But, vulnerability, it is very much about the situation. Most people try to, they get on with their life, etc. But you have a situation happen which relates to their utility, to their energy supply, and that can change all factors of what they've been used to. So we need to learn to be deliberate in our actions to make certain that we have considered the varying needs, the multiple needs, and the complexities of those, so that we can help raise awareness in the right way, bring customers along that journey with us, and say work with those partners whereby actually the trust needs that additional element in there to handhold that customer, to realise that health impacts, obviously, keeping your home warm are massive. And actually, if there happens to be a situation in a property where there is already a health issue, that could be exacerbated massively if we don't take the right steps. So there's lots of work going on, and I'm not going to talk about everything because I know that the other panelists on here as well, I've got a lot to add. But there is, a huge opportunity for us here to work collaboratively. And I don't just mean within the industry. This is about working with partners across the spectrum, because it's about reaching those audiences and, making it so that actually we're flexible, we're trusted, we're not overcomplicating things, because actually, that capability of engaging is really important, and that could just be because it's never necessarily been something that's been on a customer's agenda before. So, you know, there's lots of work to be done, and it's really key that we continue to work together on that.
Great. And Kerry, I'm sure you'd echo some similar messages to Joe, but how do you see it from SGN's perspective?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. There's a lot of collaboration in this space, and there's a lot of people working together to make sure that we do identify the barriers to being able to adopt new technology. But going back to that core bit that Joe was talking about, is looking at the circumstances today, the needs of the consumer today, but actually having that mindset, you're always looking for what could create a barrier to engagement more broadly. You know, so for us, it's very much around understanding what would be a barrier to engagement, understanding what would be a barrier to being able to adopt low carbon energy solutions, and then addressing those barriers. And I think that's probably quite clear in the project that we've launched recently, the H100 initiative in Fife, where we're doing the 100% hydrogen heat to homes program. And fundamental to that project, I know it's been discussed at conference and it's definitely in our section, but fundamental to that project is looking at how we're engaging the community more broadly. We know that we've got a very diverse community in that area. We're looking at how effective our engagement mechanisms are today. We're looking to make sure that the consumers who are involved in this program understand the benefits right up front, and also that we understand the impact so we can adapt and evolve that to bring that insight into effective engagement to the wider group, because it's initiatives like innovation drives that kind of opportunity to really embed yourself in a community and see how effective, you know, we are going to be long term with this journey. And from my perspective, that creates a great opportunity for learning and a great opportunity for knowledge share.
Thank you. And Nigel, I've given you the hardest job here as the fourth network speaker to try and answer the same question. But if you'd like to give your perspective, that'd be great.
I think I've got the easy bit because I think the others have outlined a lot of it. A couple of things I'd echo in there. You know, we refer to the Priority Services Register at the moment that the gas suppliers maintain. It serves us quite well when we go and do some work in a street, perhaps to interrupt someone's supply. But I think it's got some gaps as far as where there's barriers to people adopting the technology, whether that's literacy, numeracy, whether it's digital exclusion. I think from trials we've done on hybrid heating systems under our Freedom Project in Bridgend a couple of years ago, I think there was a lot of learning from that, particularly that we're not on our own. There's lots of different partners involved in this. We need messages to be consistent that come from different parties. So it's no good us as a gas network, going on about hybrid heating systems or hydrogen if the electricity networks are trying to sell the vision of a full heat pumps to a property. And I think some independence there as well, that is backed up by independent endorsement. And I think once the measures have actually gone in, once you've actually convinced someone to make a change, that the really important, they've got clear instructions on how to use it, on how to set things up, on how to evaluate it, and probably some support in the first few months to make sure they are seeing the benefits. We had a stakeholder event recently, and one of the charities was playing back a case of a lady. She had a new heat pump installed, not at her choice, but driven by the local authority, made a decision for her, very much given it and told her to get on with it, and really struggled with it for the first 3 or 4 months. Now she's eventually got used to it. She's seen the benefits from it and seen some cost savings from it, but was left out the original decision making, and then not really supported in the initial usage of it. So a couple of really important things there in identifying people and supporting them.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll come back to those sort of questions around choice and also communication later in the discussion. Peter, I wonder if you'd like to pick up, kind of stepping outside the networks directly, but on some of what Nigel's just said around kind of collaboration and working collaboratively to address these challenges. How's NEA supporting that, and how do you see that going forward?
Well, we'd certainly agree with a huge amount of what's previously been said. NEA as an organisation, thankfully, has very strong working relationships with all of the GDNs and increasingly DNOs to try and tackle consumer vulnerability. In terms of what we can do about it, I think the starting point for those of you that are looking at this area for the first time is to read Ofgem's Consumer Vulnerability Strategy, which was published last year. That does two important things. It talks about what we actually mean by vulnerable consumers, and they define vulnerability or a vulnerable consumer as someone that's significantly less able than a typical consumer to represent their own interests, and significantly much more likely to experience significant detriment should issues arise. And I think that whilst that's a very broad definition, it does bear down on the discrete nature of vulnerability, which can be isolated and tackled. And they try and do that. In their publication, they set out 5 key themes, which I think are a fairly clear blueprint for how low-income and vulnerable consumers can be supported through the transition to net zero. So they talk about the identification of vulnerability and using the data and insight that energy companies, energy suppliers, others will have about the circumstances of individuals. A discrete action in terms of supporting those struggling with their bills, and that can be in a number of ways to tackle the income side, so boosting people's income and doing as much as we can there. Looking at energy advice to make sure they're on the appropriate tariffs and they aren't being overcharged, and of course looking at energy efficiency, which continues to be the best way of combining social and environmental objectives. Then they talk about the important role of driving customer service, and I think it's very welcome that the GDNs in particular have a long history in supporting customers in vulnerable circumstances. But their role and requirements to address vulnerability will be firmed up as in the beginning of next price control through a new vulnerability license condition, which we support, and we hope that that's going to be effective in continuing to drive very positive behaviour within and those contractors that they work with. And then final two things I think that Ofgem highlight as are really important and has already been referenced is inclusive innovation. We know that there's a huge amount of positive developments across the energy sector to help households reduce their carbon emissions, but also their energy costs. But we often don't consider that low-income and vulnerable consumers at the outset of that innovation. And I think that there are some important changes that are being made to innovation frameworks, which should see that that become a matter of course. And then the final one is not just to think of this in isolation. In order for us to reach net zero, we need to work across multiple vectors and multiple sectors to help us get anywhere close to reaching net zero. So working across different sectors with whether that's energy and water working together or other actors coming together can really make a huge difference in how inclusive and how fair the transition to net zero is going to be.
Absolutely, and we'll certainly come back to the points around sort of Rio 2 and the role of innovation going forward. I think just before we get to that, it's clearly been a year in general when vulnerability, issues around isolation, issues around inequality in society broadly have been really much clearer perhaps than they previously have. Certainly much more part of the national debate as we wrestle with the response to and the impacts of the COVID pandemic. Kerry, if I can turn back to you, what do you think we can kind of learn from this year? How's that impacting your activity and your thinking about this agenda going forward?
Yeah, thank you. Certainly this year has been a year we've had to really go back to basics and making sure we're serving customers and safeguarding their needs, safeguarding them and our operational teams as well, because we recognise actually this year from the very outset we knew we had to keep both our customers and our employees safe during COVID. I think that gives us a common purpose as well to collaborate and work in partnership to really come up with solutions quickly. That's driven quite a lot of innovation in our own business around how we deliver our work program, how we ensure that we can do things like mains replacement and not interrupt supply was probably one of the most innovative things that we implemented this year. But in terms of, so we weren't interrupting supply, but continuing to do our work and not having to go so much into people's homes where that wasn't required. That's kind of two key drivers. But I think what for me became really apparent was that inclusion is absolutely vital during a pandemic. And inclusion is broader than whether you're able to communicate with a deaf or a blind customer during a pandemic, and that is fundamental. You need to be able to do that. That's not excluding that. But what you notice in wider society is when we have pressures of this nature is that a lot of things appear to have gone digital. To be able to accommodate people's needs, for the predominant organizations have gone digital to enable that to happen quickly and to move traffic to digital platforms. But one thing that's really clear to me is that actually some of our customers can't adopt digitalization, whether it's an affordability or due to affordability, or whether it's due to capacity or capability. As essential services, we need to think far more beyond an online experience for our customers. We need to always think about those who can't communicate in that way. And I think fundamentally, this has driven our partnership strategy for the last 12 months as well, recognizing that true inclusion or true engagement is often dependent upon the inclusion of other intermediaries, other organizations that can help us effectively communicate, making sure those key messages are still heard by people who need that information at times of crisis. So I think what it's probably done for me more broadly is recognize that innovation and change happens quickly under necessity and a common purpose. But what you mustn't do is you mustn't drive everything down one route. One size does not fit all for customers. Certainly those who the one that's really mindful at the moment is can't drive everyone down a digital solution.
Joe, I wonder if you'd like to comment on that sort of point around digitalization as well. And, as we move conferences online, everything seems to be going online, partly through necessity and partly because of opportunity or perceived opportunity. Thinking kind of more broadly, how do we make sure that we don't leave people behind?
Yeah, absolutely. So digital exclusion has become quite a big sort of area of concern for many over the sort of last sort of ever since March really. And Kerry is quite right. All of those areas that we've had before around communication, they are fundamentals. But how do we make certain that we can consider those for whichever reason it is that they're digitally excluded? And we need to make certain we don't stereotype here, because there is evidence to show that it's not about somebody who happens to be maybe registered with pensionable age on the Priority Services Register. It's for other factors, as Kerry quite rightly said. And actually you mentioned sort of kindly as part of the introduction about my work around the Mental Capacity Act. There are those other factors we need to consider about those people where actually, the written word, digitalization, etc., and maybe not the right way to bring them and engage them in what we're doing. So having a look at how we can communicate in ways beyond words, maybe through pictures, etc. So, but also having a consistent approach with key messages. And all of those elements, it is about building that self-resilience. People have to find their ways around, with some real huge difficulties. If we can help support that in ways to ensure that they can, stay engaged and be part of that journey, then that's really key. I mean, actually, as GDMs, we have throughout COVID, particularly at the very beginning, we've made certain that we had weekly catch-up calls, if not more regularly, particularly at the beginning, to ensure that we were looking for those good practices and consistency. And Kerry also mentioned a little bit earlier on at the introduction around how we can be using data better. We have flagged several times as well how actually we are but one part of this solution, working with partners, but also local authorities and government departments. There is data out there, the shielding data particularly here, to have some form of sight of which properties we're shielding as we are still actually continuing with our programme of works would be really helpful, so we can appropriately safeguard if that household doesn't have to be registered on the PSR. So there are so many factors here, and it is about us continuing to be flexible and evolve with actually what the needs are, and continually drive for that improvement and innovation.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Nigel, in terms of sort of experience around customer service this year, and how that's kind of perhaps changed views on how we approach this going forward?
Yeah, I think a lot more people have embraced digital technology, or perhaps a bit reluctant to before, but certainly as we try to restart our mains replacement work, the value of having people on the ground, knocking on doors, giving assurance to people about our works and how we could work safely in their homes was invaluable, and we see that in the number of compliments we get back, and also in our customer satisfaction scores. Ultimately, they're higher than ever, because probably there's more people in at the moment, and it's easy to engage on the doorstep with them. I think the data sharing is really key as well. I think there's a whole load of data out there we can certainly do some innovation work around and map properly to areas, not just the PSR data, but other data sets that are out there, and make better intelligent use of that. I did have frustrations during lockdown when Welsh Government were sort of waving some shielding data under our noses, and we did make a request to access it so we could almost avoid the areas where there were lots of people shielding, and they wouldn't grant us access to it, So I think there's more engagement and some learning there to share this data and protect it in the right way, absolutely. But for the greater good of all the organisations involved in this space and looking after people in, and some of them are very vulnerable and very hard to reach, there's got to be some benefits from that data being more open.
Absolutely. And kind of looking forward now, Peter, if I can come back to some of what you sort of set out around Rio 2 and the announcements this week around the price controls for electricity transmission, but mainly for this for the purpose of this discussion for gas transmission and distribution. How do you see that affecting the provision for customers in vulnerable situations going forward? I wonder if you could just flesh that out for us a little further.
Sure. I've got to make a link with the current COVID situation, though, briefly, just as a sort of segue into the framework that Ofgem have set out yesterday. So obviously we've seen reduced incomes, higher costs as a result of people staying at home, and above all, a clear overlap between the impact of COVID, which is a respiratory, and the impact of people living in cold homes, which are non-identical. Both can end up being fatal and put stress on our health services. So we have seen a big increase in the focus on our work, and our practical delivery teams are absolutely flat out. And to be frank with you, have been alongside their clients suffering the same sort of mental health issues, because it is putting a huge strain on people to be able to respond to the massive uptick in need that's out there. As a welcome part of that, yesterday we very much welcomed Ofgem setting out its final determinations, particularly as you mentioned for the gas networks. As part of that, it was very welcome that we've seen Ofgem respond to our initial concerns about the level of support that was going to be available for vulnerable customers. We had concerns alongside the companies, level of support on offer, and the amount of acceptance of the individual proposals that the companies have put forward just wasn't equivalent for the task in any year, let alone a year which was so extreme as we continue to wrestle with COVID, and that will continue to be the case from April onwards when the next price control starts. we did. Ofgem have responded to those concerns. They've increased they've doubled the amount of support available through the use it or lose it allowance. And as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, they've now clarified the timeframe for the introduction of the vulnerability license condition requirements. Both of those were kind of NEA's key focus. It's too early to say whether or not that will be an effective framework, but I think where we are now is that we've got a really good shot of making sure that the next price control really builds on the great work that's already happening in the current price control, and that low-income vulnerable consumers can be adequately treated and their needs taken care of. So we're relatively upbeat about Ofgem's announcements yesterday.
Great. And Malcolm, if I turn to you, from a gas transmission perspective, are you similarly upbeat? And how do you see sort of plans for 2021 to 26?
So for Rio T2, I was on a call today. So it's encouraging that things have moved on in terms of what's being proposed. But I think, if you have a look at the number of pages, there's a lot of detail in there we need to look at. I think the uncertainty mechanisms and such are the things that really drive change and such. There's a lot of uncertainty, and we need to understand how we address that. If I have a look at the Rio 2 determinations and our role in vulnerable customers, obviously because we know so linked to consumers, we don't have specific provisions in there for vulnerable consumers, but we are focusing on how we operate in local communities and how we interact with those local communities, and also looking at our sort of education and employment and how we make sure that we reach out to a wider audience in order to do that.
And I wonder if someone from one of the distribution networks would like to comment on this as well. Go on, Nigel.
Just to sort of put some numbers on it, if people haven't had a chance to read those determinations yet, effectively across the networks, we've now got a pot of £60 million to spend over the next 5 years on projects above our sort of business as usual activities, addressing consumer vulnerability and also making all people aware of the risks of carbon monoxide. And the other thing in addition to that is, we've all secured some funding as well within the new Network Innovation Allowance, specifically around innovation for vulnerable customers, and that sits alongside probably a wider part around net zero as a whole. So yeah, a real positive package of measures. We've got some forums that we've kicked off, and we've got the likes of Peter, Citizens Advice Bureau, and I think Energy UK involved, and we'll be involving them from February as we firm our plans up. So we'll have some projects ready to go from April. So yeah, looking really positive.
Good. I'm turning now to the Q&A. So in the audience, please do ask your questions if there's anything you'd like the panel to address. So the first question that's come in from Christine Tate kind of comes back to some of the remarks various of you were making around kind of how we identify consumers who might be in vulnerable situations, and this is specifically asking how we can encourage self-identification and deal with any potential stigma around people seeking help. Jo, would you like to address that?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. Thank you. So, there are lots of things that we can all do actually with this. It's not just about obviously GDNs and our colleagues. It's about in our work life and our private life, is in reference to raising the awareness of what the Priority Services Register is all about, and making certain that we use terminology appropriately. So things such as ensuring that we do talk about the situation, being the sort of where the vulnerability lies, helps people to self-identify a little bit more. That if they were without their essential services, how would they be able to, sort of continue to live safely and keep warm and, sort of connect with the support that's available. So it's more about allowing people to understand themselves how it could enable them. But actually, one of the things that we've also found is there is that trust element. So very much, you know, if, for instance, Matt, you spoke to your family members, your neighbours, people that knew you and trusted you, they're more likely to listen and think, okay, this priority service register, I could maybe see how that would benefit me. But actually, a little piece that we've often found is that particularly when you get those particularly independent individuals, you know, as they're sort of, you know, maybe getting a little bit older, that you know, to actually talk about how the PSR can help support their family, maybe, you know, and their neighbours, because they're concerned about their family and neighbours. It allows them to sort of self-identify a little bit more. This is not about labelling them or others. It is about ensuring that there's awareness of services and support that is available to keep them safe, warm and independent in their home. So, you know, lots of things we can do to remove the stigma. If I could encourage everybody on the call to stop using terminology like vulnerable customer, because then you are, in effect, putting that customer off of that self-identification. That'd be really fabulous. Working with those trusted partners, you know, making certain that that reach to the service users that they support, you know, talking about things in very open, you know, practical ways and human ways, and sharing those stories, it brings it to life and allows people to understand how they would benefit in the event of. And I think by keeping it you know, sort of very real, being practical about how it supports people, rather than labelling people, it allows people to then actually sort of think, okay, this will help me and this helps me stay independent. So how can I make certain I'm included in that? But I know others will have plenty to say on that, so I won't say any more.
Well, I think, Kerry, we might also bring in the question that Brian McNeil's asked as well, which is kind of coming at a similar problem from a different angle, which is around how you can use property types to identify people who might need support, and effectively how you get that kind of get that data and effectively build data. And we touched on a little bit of that in the discussion around digitalization earlier, but I wonder if you could both follow on from Joe and also
yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, I completely agree with what Joe said, and I've worked on the priority services register, owning one of the biggest ones in my previous role, very, very closely value the importance of ensuring that people know if they're eligible. I think it's a bit like Joe said, there's a bit of a stigma if you say, did you know there's this vulnerability register? But you put it in the language of, did you know that your household's eligible for this? This is good stuff. Then we saw a very different response, just by being something that you've earned almost. And I think the one that I learned that very early on when I asked somebody if they were elderly when trying to talk about the PSR, and that didn't go down too well. However, when I used the expression, did you know if you're of pensionable age or eligible for free blah blah blah, they're like, well, sign me up, I'm eligible, it's mine, I've earned it. So a part of it is around self-identification, is around understanding your customer group well enough to know what works for them when offering it, and that comes quite keenly with the strong partnerships. And your question about data, I think that leads to strong partnerships as well, in terms of you use data to identify the partnerships that you wish to create based on the needs that you wish to fulfill. In terms of the question on data and where do we get it from, I think each organisation will do that slightly differently. Yes, we get the priority services data from the supply side at times of incident management in particular, but each one of us will have different relationships more broadly, more locally, with resilience partners and or other organisations. There are challenges with that because safeguarding customer data is really important to everyone, as you would all know. In terms of household level data, or at least geographic data that would indicate need, I think you'll find each one of us will have a different way of addressing that problem as well. Most of us have vulnerability mapping tools that look at societal information, socioeconomic data, data that would help us identify those who would be more eligible for something like the Fuel Poor Network Extension Scheme. And that data is vital for us in terms of incident management, but it's equally really helpful in putting the groundwork in the community to identify those who would be more likely to be eligible for the Fuel Poor Network Extension Scheme. So data is absolutely an underpinning factor in the way that we operate as network companies. It helps us define our partnership strategy. It helps us do our targeted work to identify eligibility for fuel pool network extension scheme. And it helps us define the services during incident management, who we need to be working with and why, based on the community demographics. It's really vital.
And if we build from that and kind of look towards the challenges in the energy system moving forward as we journey towards net zero, I think a couple of kind of relevant questions here. But if I can come back to you, Malcolm, and some of the points you made at the start around the importance of the heat decarbonisation debate. There's a question from Gerard Lane, looking at those who are least able to invest, least engaged, and how they would be able to access new heating technology, fabric retrofit. Clearly, some massive issues there in terms of who pays for heat decarbonisation, I think, as well as the distributional impacts from a social perspective. We also need to think about some of the geographic impacts there. Given that opportunities might look different in different parts of the country. So I wondered if you could expand a little on what you said at the start around how we can approach those challenges.
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you. I look at my house and I've got my heating on today, and I'm looking to understand how I can help decarbonise my house. And I must admit, I'm not sure I know the answer. So I don't know what solutions can help me. I've got insulation and other things. So understanding how we provide good advice to everyone, in all customers, regardless of who they are, and how we can go about this is one thing. And as I mentioned earlier about the affordability and how we can get customers, consumers to install the right equipment and the equipment to decarbonise. So I think that information is absolutely imperative that everyone knows how to do that. Not all consumers know that. And as Peter mentioned, you know, the definition, Ofgem's definition of vulnerability is significantly less able to engage with the energy market. And if we have a look at the future, you know, our expectation is that we will have to have much more prosumers where we are looking at our in-house demand and how to manage that and balance that, and installing equipment that does that. So I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one size fits all is also mentioned. So what works for me in my own house? How do I decarbonize? What tools are available? Insulation, batteries, and other things. And then maybe when we understand what we do need to do, are there business models that need to change in order to implement that? So are there, you know, the heat as a service or something that we can implement that actually doesn't impose so much costs up front, or something can be done differently in order for consumers, in order to invest initially? And of course, there's the grants and the role for policy, the green home grants that we currently have. But again, we need to make sure that they're accessible, easy to use, the right advice, impartial advice coming through, that all consumers need to know what they need to do to decarbonise. So there's a number. The problem is there's no one organisation that does all this. So that, you know, how do we make sure that consumers get that information is really important, and then how we fund it and get access to it is second.
And clearly, collaboration and partnership working's come out a couple of times in the discussion already, as you'd expect in a topic that affects so many people and so many different organisations as well. Nigel, from what Malcolm's just sort of talked about, engaging customers is clearly really key, and I think the question from Amelie from Traverse touches on this as well. In terms of shaping a socially inclusive transition, but what can we learn from projects you've been involved in? But also, I think that kind of point at the end of that question is really key. How can we ensure that we're using people's own experiences in the way that Malcolm's just touched on to help them through this journey and signpost how we manage decarbonisation, particularly of heat?
Yeah, sure. It's not an easy problem, is it? Like I think, like Malcolm said, you know, I'm quite close to this, and I live in a sort of end of terrace house built in 1904. which I know leaks heat out and will cost me a fortune if even I thought about external wall insulation, and I'm someone who potentially could afford to pay. Going back to how we work in collaboration, I think we've had some good success with working hand in hand with partners, people like Warm Wales, and working hand in hand with local authorities. So coming back to the question really about how you identify areas to go and work in, we've worked with whether it's Cardiff Council or people in the Swansea Valleys or North Wales. And working with those people, we've identified and used their local knowledge to identify communities to go into, and whether that's a bit of an intervention of taking gas into an area for the first time, or going into people where they've already got gas and helping them identify benefits they should be claiming, getting them onto the right tariffs, from energy efficiency advice, behavioural change, as well as linking up with funding that's there at the moment. I think in Wales we've got some advantages. I think the Welsh Government have got some good focus on this. We're currently sort of looking at their future fuel poverty strategy, but also involving their decarbonisation strategy. And this will certainly be a focus there around worst first. So we're looking at the most inefficient homes, which have got a good overlay with the people who are in severe fuel poverty as well. And, as Joe and everyone else has identified, we are one part of that jigsaw. Gas might be the best option, either to put in or to maintain. And in which case we'll do that and we'll provide our funding. If it's not, we totally recognise it, and it might be a case the gas comes out of there and something else goes in. We shouldn't be precious about that. We need to look at each property and do the right thing for them. But it is reaching those most vulnerable people. And I think the other thing just to recognise is, there's a couple of different groups really. There are private householders, the lonely person who's elderly and lives in a property which they struggle to maintain and is probably in a poor state in terms of damp, and they don't service their boilers. Very hard to reach. So partnerships play a good benefit there. But a lot of people in vulnerable situations looked after by social landlords or private landlords. So really important we engage with those as well and make sure they're aware of all the technologies so they can properly assess the pros and cons of each and make informed decisions.
Peter, I'm sure you have some reflections on those points as well, and some things you can bring in from NEA's experience. So I'd be interested in that. I'd also be interested in your perspective on the question that Ollie Macken has raised, which is more around the sort of project delivery and linking this back to the role of innovation projects, and how we should go about assessing cost benefit in relation to projects which can help support customers in vulnerable situations. What are the best ways of kind of considering interventions, and particularly innovation, and justifying them within that sort of price control context?
Well, I think just to tackle the last bit first, I think there has been a lot of positive work. I think it was led by SGN to look to standardise the methodology that the industry uses about return on social investment. I think that's been very welcome to try and make sure we're comparing apples with apples when, at a regulator level, we're looking at comparing value for projects on any set metric. That's really really important to get on the same page in terms of that particular metric, but just in general. I think the human element of this is vitally important as well. Obviously, our organisation has strong contact points with customers that are in appalling circumstances, and you get to see the value of your endeavours by keeping in contact with them and not just doing a sort of project of evaluation and calling it quits, is to try and have a continuous engagement with those households to see whether or not their circumstances continue to be improved. That's not obviously practical for every touch point that companies are going to have with vulnerable customers, but potentially a sample across the range of types of tenures, types of buildings, types of income profiles, types of characteristics or vulnerabilities that they might manifest. It could be possible to have that at a company level. I think just generally, our takeaway is possibly tasked to wrap up 40 years worth of kind of insight into a couple of minutes. But I think that our biggest takeaway is that whilst efforts across the industry and across a range of actors have been vital in terms of bearing down on particularly the issues of fuel poverty, but generally tackling consumer vulnerability, we aren't yet the sum of our parts, and we've got to be. And I think that there's a sense, and I think Joe's continuously raised this throughout the session about the need to provide consistency, and we need to move away from an idea that we've got a scheme over here that did some great stuff, but it was only on a sort of temporary basis, to really raising our game, so all consumers within a geographical patch or a network curtilage can expect to receive the same level of service, albeit that there's a bespoke response in relation to their specific needs. So, quite an ambitious goal, but one that's vitally important if we're really to get beyond the sort of sound bites and really make sure that we're improving people's lives and really changing their fortunes for the better. And we've got a great opportunity to do that.
And a common challenge there, I think, as we've discussed across the 2 days at this conference around how you take innovation, new approaches, success from projects and trials, and kind of make sure that's rolled out where it's proven to be valuable. So I think that's a really important point in general. We've just got a few minutes to go. I think the only audience question that we haven't directly addressed was from Scott Restrick around how we ensure that technology is equally available to all households. But I think you've kind of picked up a lot of the kind of potential approaches there in answer to other questions. I wondered, just to finish from each of you, if we were running this panel at ENIC 2026 at the end of the RIIO-2 price control period, in one sentence, what would you like to say that we would have achieved by then? I'll come to Jo first. She's top of my screen.
Thank you. So I think that really, to ensure that we've got that human factor across this, because this is people's lives, it's people's homes. I think one of the things, if we can look back and say that we've all been generous with everything that we've done, sharing those opportunities to be more consistent, and to ensure that inclusion, to get away from those stigmas as well, making certain that we're supporting communities, because there is that realization that we all live and work in those communities. We are part of that ourselves. So just really touched on when Malcolm was talking about looking at his own situation and the house, and how's he going to achieve all of this. Everybody, no matter what the situation, it's that same question, and we just need to continue that human approach, that open approach, and be generous in how we talk with others, how we listen and collaborate with others to achieve something which we can all be proud of.
Thank you. Stretching my one sentence criteria, I think.
Sorry.
I'll let you get away with it. Malcolm.
Yeah, so I think for me, as focusing on heat, as I've mentioned, but as I mentioned at the very start, I think we have an opportunity here when we address how to provide net zero heat, that we take vulnerable customers with us and improve their situation. So I would like at the end of 2026 to have started to take the opportunity to improve warm and comfortable homes for all.
Kerry.
Oh, I love that you've said that. I think that's very quite a warm statement, and recognises how much time plays into this. For me, I think the spirit of the programs that we've been with the release of the draft determination, the final determination, really plays upon this responsible attitude of working collaboratively to ensure that consumers are involved in this transition. I would like at the end of this price control period to be able to be trusted, to be able to demonstrate how collaboration got us a lot further on, and that that consumers who are vulnerable are very clearly taken on this journey with us. We can demonstrate the fundamental change that we've made as a group of organisations to ensure that net zero is part of the national conversation from a gas network perspective.
Nigel.
Yeah, I think I'd like to be in a position where we've achieved sort of clarity as far as policy. We've got proven technologies and we've got a clear roadmap that we're on. At the moment, it feels that we're at the start of that journey. We can see options, announcements from government and climate change committees of where we want to go. We need to build that roadmap now, and hopefully we'll be a way down that journey by the time we get to GD3.
And Peter.
Again, just whether or not consistently we've been able to support the most vulnerable customers. I think that will be the real litmus test, and put them in the best shot possible of hoping to reach net zero, or at least be in a position to get close, or at least consider it.
Thank you very much. And we noted in the energy system transition panel yesterday that heat is probably the key decarbonisation challenge, or certainly the one which is going to affect literally every household in the UK. So I'm not surprised that that's come out in relation to the really urgent imperative to think about how all customers are brought on that journey, and what we can do through the RIIO-2 period, and using innovation, new technology, and new approaches to ensure that we're protecting the most vulnerable. So thank you all very much for taking part in the panel. So thank you to Joe, Malcolm, Kerry, Nigel, and Peter. Thank you for your questions, for joining us in the audience, for joining us at ENIC 2020 over the last 2 days, and we really look forward to seeing everyone next year, hopefully in person. But I think that we've also shown what some of the benefits of digital engagement can be through this event, and that's obviously something we'd like to make sure we're continuing as well. So thank you for your input, and hope to see you all next year.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.